Nestled in the heart of Oregon, where the urban sprawl gives way to the dense, towering pines of the Whispering Woods, an ordinary hiking trip took a sinister turn. The sun was setting, casting long shadows as two friends, Emma and Jake, ventured deeper into the forest. They had planned this trip for months, eager to escape the stress of their jobs in Portland. Little did they know, this forest had a history of disappearances that would soon envelop them in a chilling mystery. Emma was a wildlife photographer, always seeking the perfect shot. Jake, a history buff, was fascinated by the legends surrounding the woods. Though they were skeptical about the tales of lost hikers and strange occurrences, they couldn't shake an uneasy feeling as they ventured deeper. "Jake, did you hear that?" Emma's voice trembled as she paused, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. Jake strained his ears, but all he could hear was the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a raven. "It's probably just the wind, Em. These old trees make all kinds of sounds." They continued walking, but the feeling of being watched persisted. The path grew narrower, and the trees seemed to close in around them. Emma stopped again, her eyes wide with concern. This time, Jake heard it too, a faint sound, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably human. "Emma, Jake." The voice was barely audible, but it sent chills down their spines. "Who's there?" Jake called out, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no response, only the whispering wind. They quickened their pace, but the sound followed them, growing louder and more insistent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest was plunged into darkness. They fumbled for their flashlights, the beams cutting through the inky blackness. The sounds grew louder, more urgent, now echoing from all directions. Panic set in as they realized they were hopelessly lost. Emma's flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. "Jake, wait!" she cried, reaching out blindly. "Keep moving, Emma, we have to find a way out." Jake's voice was strained, filled with fear. They stumbled through the underbrush, branches clawing at their clothes. The sounds became a cacophony, surrounding them, closing in. Emma tripped and fell, her camera smashing against a rock. As she struggled to her feet, she saw a faint light in the distance. "Jake, look!" she pointed, her voice trembling with hope. They hurried towards the light, crashing through the underbrush. The sounds grew louder, almost deafening. As they broke through the trees, they found themselves in a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. They hesitated, the sounds now a low hum, urging them forward. Desperate and exhausted, they approached the cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a cozy interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Hello?" Jake called out, stepping inside. The warmth was comforting, a stark contrast to the cold, dark forest outside. Emma followed, closing the door behind her. The sounds were gone, replaced by the crackling fire. They sank into the old, worn-out chairs, their exhaustion catching up with them. "Maybe we can wait here until morning," Emma suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, his eyes heavy with sleep. As they drifted off, a shadow moved outside the window, watching them. Morning came, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees, illuminating the clearing. Emma and Jake awoke, the events of the previous night feeling like a distant nightmare. They stepped outside, the forest bathed in golden light. The sounds were gone, replaced by the soothing sounds of nature. "Let's get out of here," Jake said, his voice firm. They found a path leading back to civilization, their steps quickening as they neared the edge of the forest. As they emerged from the trees, they looked back one last time. The cabin was still there, a testament to their ordeal. Emma and Jake never spoke of that night again, but the memory haunted them. They left Oregon, seeking solace in the busy streets of Portland. But every now and then, late at night, they could still hear the faint rustling of leaves, a chilling reminder of the Whispering Woods. To this day, the forest remains a place of mystery. Hikers speak of strange sounds and eerie feelings, but no one has ever solved the mystery of the Whispering Woods. Skeptics dismiss it as just a story, but those who have ventured into its depths know better. So, if you ever find yourself in the heart of Oregon, wandering through the towering pines, be careful. Listen closely to the sounds on the wind. You never know what secrets the forest might be hiding, or what might be hiding in the forest. It was a crisp autumn day when three friends decided to take a weekend trip to the woods just outside of Seattle. Lisa, Mark, and Antonio had been friends since college, and they relished any chance to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. This time, they chose a remote trail known for its beautiful fall foliage and serene atmosphere. The locals called it the Vanishing Path, not because of any supernatural occurrences, but due to the dense underbrush that often made the trail hard to follow. The trio parked their car at the trailhead and began their hike, chatting animatedly about their jobs and plans for the future. Lisa, an avid hiker, led the way with her trail map in hand. Mark, a tech enthusiast, took photos with his new camera, while Antonio, a history teacher, shared stories about the area's past. Did you know this forest was once home to a small logging community? Antonio began, his voice carrying a hint of excitement. The town was abandoned after the logging industry collapsed. Lisa rolled her eyes playfully. You and your history lessons. Let's focus on finding a good spot to set up camp before it gets dark. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the trail became less defined, and the trees grew denser. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of the forest. They found a small clearing and decided it was the perfect place to set up their tents. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow through the trees, they gathered around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing laughs. Remember that time in college when Mark got lost in the library? Lisa teased, causing Antonio to burst into laughter. Hey, that place is a maze. Mark defended himself, chuckling. The mood was light and carefree until they heard a distant sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoing through the trees. They fell silent, straining to identify the source. Probably just a woodpecker, Antonio suggested, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Lisa nodded, but the sound unsettled her. Let's just keep the fire going a bit longer. As night fell, the tapping continued intermittently, growing slightly louder each time. Despite their unease, they eventually retired to their tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Lisa awoke in the middle of the night to a rustling sound outside her tent. She unzipped the flap cautiously and peered out, seeing nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees. She could hear Mark and Antonio's soft snores, assuring her that her friends were safe. Just as she was about to zip up the tent, she saw a shadow move swiftly between the trees. Antonio? Mark? She whispered, hoping one of them had ventured outside. There was no response. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out, the beam cutting through the darkness. She moved towards the spot where she had seen the shadow, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, she heard a low whisper, indistinct but chilling. She swung the flashlight around but saw nothing. Panic began to set in, and she hurried back to the tents, waking the others. Guys, I think there's someone out here, she said, her voice shaking. Mark and Antonio quickly emerged, flashlights in hand. They scanned the area but found no signs of anyone. It could have been an animal, Mark suggested, trying to sound rational. Maybe, but we should stay together just in case, Antonio agreed. They huddled by the fire, which they had rekindled, and kept watch for the rest of the night. The tapping sound returned, closer this time, but they saw no movement. The hours dragged on, and just before dawn, the sound stopped abruptly. With the first light of morning, they decided to pack up and head back to the trailhead. As they gathered their gear, they noticed something strange. The trail they had followed the day before seemed to have vanished. The path was overgrown, and there was no sign of the markers they had seen. How is this possible? Lisa asked, bewildered. We must have gotten turned around in the dark, Mark reasoned. Let's retrace our steps. They spent hours trying to find the trail, but the forest seemed different, almost as if it had shifted overnight. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. Their phones had no signal, and the map seemed useless in this ever-changing landscape. As they wandered, they came across an old, dilapidated cabin that wasn't on any map. Desperation drove them to approach it, hoping to find someone who could help. The cabin was empty, filled with the remnants of a bygone era, rusted tools, faded photographs, and tattered furniture. "Look at this," Antonio said, holding up a newspaper dated 1905. The headline read, "Logging Community Mysteriously Abandoned." Chills ran down their spines. The stories Antonio had mentioned seemed all too real now. They decided to leave the cabin and keep moving, hoping to find the trail again. As they walked, they heard the tapping sound once more, now accompanied by whispers. They quickened their pace, fear driving them forward. Hours later, just as their hope was fading, they stumbled upon the trailhead, their car still parked where they had left it. Exhausted and shaken, they quickly left the forest, vowing never to return. Back in Seattle, they tried to make sense of what had happened. The experience left them with more questions than answers. The vanishing path lived up to its name, and they couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had intentionally misled them. Lisa, Mark, and Antonio never spoke of the incident again, but the memory haunted them. They continued their lives, but the whispers and the tapping sound remained etched in their minds. The mystery of the vanishing path was one they would never forget. So, if you ever find yourself in the woods outside Seattle, beware of the vanishing path. The forest has a way of playing tricks on those who enter, and you may find yourself lost in its depths, just as they did. It was early October when Sarah, a seasoned hiker and outdoor enthusiast, decided to explore a new trail in the remote woods of Northern California. She had heard about the beauty of the area from fellow hikers and was excited to document her journey for her blog. Sarah was careful and always prepared, with a fully charged phone, a detailed map, and plenty of supplies. The trail started off easy, with well-marked paths and breathtaking views of the fall foliage. Sarah took her time, capturing photos of the vibrant leaves and the occasional deer that crossed her path. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of nature. A few hours into her hike, Sarah reached a fork in the trail. One path led to a well-known lookout point, while the other seemed less traveled, almost hidden by the overgrowth. Intrigued by the idea of discovering something new, she chose the less traveled path. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the trail became more challenging. The trees grew denser, and the sounds of wildlife seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. Sarah's excitement turned into unease, but she pressed on, confident in her abilities. After another hour of hiking, Sarah realized she hadn't seen any trail markers for quite some time. She pulled out her map and compass, trying to get her bearings, but the dense forest made it difficult to pinpoint her location. She decided to backtrack, but as she turned around, she noticed something strange. The path she had just walked seemed different, almost unfamiliar. A chill ran down her spine as she realized she might be lost. She took a deep breath and reminded herself to stay calm. She still had plenty of daylight and supplies. Sarah retraced her steps carefully, looking for any familiar landmarks. As she walked, she noticed the forest seemed to change around her. Trees that she was sure she'd passed before now looked different. A rustling sound behind her made her turn quickly, expecting to see an animal, but there was nothing there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she continued walking, her senses on high alert. As the sun began to set, Sarah's situation became more dire. She had been wandering for hours, and her surroundings only grew more unfamiliar. She decided to set up camp for the night and try again in the morning. She found a small clearing, set up her tent, and built a fire. The warmth and light provided some comfort, but the feeling of being watched persisted. She tried to call for help, but there was no signal. She sent a few text messages with her location, hoping they would eventually go through. As she sat by the fire, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The night was long and restless. Every little sound seemed amplified in the silence of the forest. Sarah thought she heard footsteps several times, but each time she checked, there was nothing there. She told herself it was just her imagination, fueled by the stress and fear of being lost. In the morning, Sarah packed up her camp and continued her search for the trail. The forest seemed even more disorienting in the daylight. She came across a small stream and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water or a familiar landmark. After several hours, she saw something in the distance, a cabin, old and weathered, barely visible through the trees. Relief washed over her as she hurried towards it, hoping to find someone who could help her. The cabin was abandoned, filled with the remnants of a life long past. Dust-covered furniture, old photographs, and rusted tools were scattered around. Sarah searched for anything that might indicate recent human activity but found nothing. Desperation set in as she realized she was truly alone. She decided to leave a note with her name and date, hoping that if someone found the cabin, they might come looking for her. She continued following the stream, her energy waning. Just as she was about to give up hope, she heard voices in the distance. She called out, her voice hoarse from lack of use. The voices grew louder, and soon she saw a group of hikers approaching. They were part of a search party looking for her, alerted by the texts that had finally gone through. Sarah was exhausted and dehydrated but overjoyed to see other people. The hikers gave her water and helped her back to their camp, where she was able to contact the authorities and arrange for her rescue. Later, as she recovered at home, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about her ordeal. She had been well prepared, yet the forest had still managed to disorient and nearly overwhelm her. The experience left her with a deep respect for the power of nature and the importance of always being cautious. So, if you ever find yourself in the remote woods of Northern California, remember Sarah's story. Stay on the marked trails, trust your instincts, and always be prepared. You never know what might be waiting in the depths of the forest.